Hello, this is Nick Lodato, and this is part 6 in the series Creating Accessible Documents in Word. Today's episode deals with alternative text, alt text. So let's begin. What we want to do is talk about what alternative text is. It is essentially, as it indicates by its name, an alternative description of an image, a photograph, a chart, a graph, any visual content that is not comprehensible by a person without vision. So it's a text alternative to seeing that picture. What is important is that the alternative text convey the meaning behind the illustration, the graphic, the image, its content, and if it's a functional image, that is, if it's a link to something else, then its function, so that the person who needs to view this with a screen reader and can't see it is not at a disadvantage. Now, one of the leading resources of information in terms of how to make web pages accessible is a group called WebAIM. It's Web Accessibility in Mind. And although its focus is largely on web content, its rules and suggestions are completely appropriate to documents such as Word. And the key things that it looks for in alternative text are that the alternative text is accurate and equivalent to what the person would see if they could see the image, that it be succinct, not too long, but gets to the point, and that it not be redundant with other things that may appear in the document, such as accompanying text or captions. So I urge you to take a look at webaim.org, the URL webaim.org/techniques/alt text, ALTTEXT. Now let's move to hands-on. So here we have a document, a Word document, that's our focus here, that talks a little bit about alternative text. And embedded in the Word document is an image that has absolutely nothing to do with alternative text. It's just an image that I liked. How would a person using a screen reader get any value from the image? So let's pretend for a moment that the image is actually relevant to the text that's around it. It's a quote. It's a quote from my favorite author, Mark Twain. So the alternative text in this case, to get the full content, would say Mark Twain quoted as, "Whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it is time to pause and reflect." So the thing I have in the talk button would be appropriate alt text for that image because it fully conveys the meaning of that image. Now, it's not as succinct as one would like. Typically, for succinctness, you're looking at a sentence at most, ideally a few words. But again, it needs to convey the meaning. It needs to convey the content. So I think it works for accuracy and equivalency. And as long as it's not redundant. So for instance, if you actually use that quote in text, then you would not need to have the entire quote in the alt text. If you use that text in a caption, you would not need to have it in the alt text because that would be redundant. So, just some notes about alternative text since we're here. Everything that's in your document that is non-textual needs to have a description associated with it in the form of alternative text. It does not necessarily have to be this thing that we'll talk about in a few seconds, and I'll show you how to do, called alt text. Although every image should have alt text defined, it could be defined as empty. So for instance, the second bullet here, if the image is purely decorative, maybe it's a divider or just a pretty illustration off to the side that conveys no message and has no content, that image can be tagged as with alt text of null, so that it's basically not read, it's ignored by a screen reader because it's not conveying any special content to the reader. So in that case, alt text is not necessary, although one would tag it as alt text empty. The caption to a photo or a graph, if it clearly conveys the message, the content, could be used instead of alt text, or the text that's surrounding the image, if it explains all the content in the image, that can fulfill the function of alternative text. So it doesn't have to literally be this tag called alt text. However, if there's function behind the image, even if there's no content, if there's function behind it, that is, it's a link to something else, you have to have alt text so that the user who is using a screen reader can understand what it's doing. So, alt text needs to convey the content of the image accurately and in an equivalent nature to the person who could see the image. It needs to be succinct, and it should not be redundant with text that's accompanying it or with captions. In general, you don't really need to start alt text out with photo of or image of or graph of, because that really is kind of assumed. I'll show you some examples in a second. The main thing to remember is that while this is one of the easiest things to do in terms of making an accessible document, you'll see in a second how easy it is to create alt text. While it's the easiest thing to do, it's also the most difficult to do in terms of deciding what that alt text should look like. So let's start right here. This image, if I highlight the image and right-click the image, we see that there's an option for editing alt text. That pops up a window to the side that contains the alt text that you see here that I placed in for this image. Now, interestingly enough, this thing that I added, this thought bubble, is also an image, and it should have alt text, but since it conveys no additional information to the alt text I've already put in, it would be completely redundant for a screen reader to read this. It would be exactly the same as the alt text with the first image. So I have marked it as decorative by clicking this little button. What that does in the code behind Word, the invisible code that we don't see, is it basically says alt equal null, which I showed you on the previous screen. Now let's look at a couple more examples. So here's an article taken from a website on the history of Rome. And it has some images. Now, I have not put alt text in these images. So if I right-click again and say edit alt text, you'll see this is empty. Now, Word actually will try to generate a description for your use. I haven't found these to be particularly helpful. This says group of people on a cart. So I'm going to remove that, and instead I actually type something, because we all know that I'm not the greatest typist in the world. So I'll copy this, and my suggested text would be people bringing the Greeks' gift horse into Troy. I think that's not incredibly redundant, although there is a little bit of redundancy. I would rather that image be explained than marking it as purely decorative. Now, again, alternately, I could have provided a caption to this image that said exactly the same thing instead of alt tag, and then mark the image as decorative so that both are not read. Here's another image. This shows the Trojan prince Aeneas escaping Troy, and my proposed text for that would be Aeneas carrying his father and leading his wife and son out of the burning city of Troy. It communicates to the non-sighted reader what the core message is of the painting. Now notice I did not say painting of. I was tempted to, I'm always tempted to, but bottom line, you don't need to say it. It's pretty obvious it's not a photograph or a graph. There weren't photographs in 700 years BC. A few more examples. Here's a map. And again, I'd be tempted to say map of. Now the text surrounding it says, like Odysseus or Ulysses, Aeneas had a 10-year journey to his final destination. His journey carried him throughout the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, if that's the only message I have as an author, I could tag this as decorative. If I wanted to get a little more explicit about where he had been, for instance, I could mention the key stops along the journey. So he stopped at Thrace and Delos and Crete, Actium, Tarentum, Sicily, Carthage, Cumae, and finally ended it in Latium. I think that it would be appropriate to call this decorative if all you cared about was that he did a 10-year journey from Troy. Well, that doesn't even say where, so I would probably want to give the destination in the text if I were going to mark this as decorative. Or again, I could use a simple caption, say the journey of Aeneas from Troy to Latium. And I think one more. Here is when Aeneas, actually there's a couple more. Aeneas arrived in Carthage and met the queen. So here is a painting representing Aeneas telling Queen Dido about the Trojan War. A simple alt text. Again, in this case, it may be better to use a caption instead of alt text so that the sighted reader gets the benefit of understanding what they were talking about. And finally, well, we'll only talk about this one. This is another map, and again, I don't need to say map of, but if I'm interested in this story, let's see, the lead-in is that Carthage was founded by Phoenicians, and the text surrounding it says that there were cities throughout that came from Tyre, the Phoenicians, and settled throughout the Mediterranean. So do I really need to say Tyre, Sidon, Kitron, Carthage, Panormus? I can potentially mark this as decorative. And finally, here's a painting of the battle between Aeneas and Turnus. And again, I could use a alt text, or I could do that in a caption, or in this case, since Aeneas defeated Turnus in single combat and fulfills his destiny, actually tells the story of the photo, perhaps it really is decorative, so that we would tag it as decorative. So alt text is part science, that is the act of writing the code or using Word to specify the alt text, but also art, that is deciding what's appropriate and when it's appropriate. Well, let's get back to, one other thing to note. If you remember from the tables presentation, this was a negative exemplar because this was embedded as an image. Now, it would be difficult to create a concise, succinct alt text for this table because there's a lot of data in it, and you can imagine how much data can be in a table. This was not the best way to do that, that is, embed the table as an image, because then you are tasked with making this content equivalent for a non-sighted reader. And if you recall, the solution was to not embed it as an image, but rather embed it as a table that has defined rows and columns and can be read appropriately by a screen reader. So the screen reader actually tells you when you get to this cell that it's residence age 18 plus, Midwest 52 is the value. So there are ways to get around the alt text altogether that are preferable, and in this case, tables is preferable. Just wanted to remind you all of that. So back to the presentation and a summary. Everything that's in your document that is not textual, that is photograph, a graph, an illustration, should be described with alternative text in one of those three ways. You could either describe it in the accompanying text, you can describe it in a caption to the image, or you can describe it in what's called alt text. Regardless of how you do it, there should always be some alt text associated with the image so the screen reader knows what to do. Even if it's just clicking that little checkbox to say it's decorative. Purely decorative images have empty or null alt text. If the image is used as a link, and this is more common in a web page than in a Word document, but Word documents can link to other things as well, then it needs to have alt text, and the alt text needs to tell the person what happens if they click it. So they know it's a link and they can choose to click it. The key ideas are that the alternative text, whether it's alt text or the other forms, need to convey the image, the contents of the image, both accurately and equivalently. It needs to be succinct, so it doesn't ramble on. It's not a gigantic paragraph. It should not be redundant to the captions or to the associated text. And you generally want to avoid, you want to reduce the words. You want it to be succinct as far as possible. So photo of or illustration of or painting of are typically not necessary, but that's really part of your discretion, what message, why you are doing it, why you're including the image, and what you want to say with it. So the key thing here to remember is that the alternative text associated with an image is really going to vary based on the context that the image is presented in. So that a given image may have completely different alternative text in one chapter of a book than in another chapter of a book or another book or document altogether, because context matters. It depends on what's happening in the text surrounding it, depends on things like captions, depends on why you put the image there and what you want the reader to get out of it. That about wraps it up. As usual, please contact me if you have any thoughts or suggestions. Until the next time, thank you for listening.